Hello, my name is Aidan Martins from InPlay, and today I'm following up on the InPlay and ePiece webinar, and I will be showing you how to have a triggered BLE beacon. Um, so this applies to both the Ion 100 evaluation kit as well as the low power energy harvesting kit that we have with ePiece. So right now I have my advertising sets here. I'm going to select advertising set 1 and hit edit. I still have the custom beacon that I set up on my previous tutorial on how to make a custom beacon. So this is just a beacon with the name test, the public company ID of 1111, which is arbitrary. This could be anything. And then on the data, I have the voltage level and the on-chip temperature sensor information. Now going to advertising mode, this is where I can select a trigger. So triggered advertising is what I'll select. Advertising event count here. This is how many times I will advertise in response to a triggered advertising event. So default value is 6, but this is, of course, can be as low as 1 or as much as you need. This next option, which is selected, is trigger event will reset trig advertising event count. What this means is if a new trigger comes in while a other advertising set that is from a trigger is still happening, it will reset that count up here back to the value. So let's say I'm three advertising events in to a total of 6. A new trigger comes in, and now I do 6 more in response, rather than just finishing the 3 and stopping. But that is what that option will do. And then single trigger, this is applicable to things like a factory test, where you want something to be triggerable once for the sake of testing, and then no more, you don't need it to happen again. Reoccurring trigger means the trigger event will happen every time you trigger it. And then advertise indefinitely after first trigger. This means that once you trigger, the device will just continuously advertise as if it was a periodic or continuous advertising set. Okay, so I'll stick it with reoccurring trigger for now. For the trigger sources, I will start with the GPIO trigger sources here. So I've selected mGPIO4. So I will go to my GPIO tab here on the left. In it, I will go down to GPIO4, and I will put it as an input. Let's say my use case is I have a button wired externally to the Ion 100 that is wired to mGPIO4, and when I press it, a falling edge will happen, and I want that to trigger the device. So in that case, I want to have pull up so that the default state of the mGPIO4 is high and is not floating. For the trigger source, I will pick falling edge. So I can do high level, low level, rising edge, or falling edge. I will pick falling edge. And then for latching behavior, this means will it keep its state during sleep? Well, since I don't want anything to happen to it until I press the button, I do want it to keep its state during sleep, so I'll click latch. Okay, I go back here. I'll disable these options for now. And if I was to reset the device and click run in RAM, after I've selected the correct COM port, you saw that I got the successful run in RAM message, meaning that now if I send a falling edge to mGPIO4, I will be able to detect this beacon on the InPlay BLE scanner app or other such application. Okay. So now let's say I want my my beacon to trigger on some ADC temperature sensor data. So I will pick trigger 3 for this. So I'll pick a low trigger and a high trigger, and I will explain what these mean. So let's back up for a second. I will go to the ADC channel and enable ADC channel 0, which is coincidentally mGPIO4. So I'll have that enabled for now. No need to mess with these options unless you have specific characteristics of your ADC temperature sensor that you need to change. We'll go back to my main page here, go to global trigger settings, and at trigger 3, which is the one I selected ADC channel 0. Of course, there are other options here, the other ADC channels, one-wire sensor, on-chip VCC, that's voltage, with the I2C slave data. And of course, there are other trigger sources I can pick, which can each be assigned a different source here. So I will just leave trigger source 3 as my only option. And now the data that comes in on ADC channel 0 will be compared to these integers here. And for the low threshold, if it is below this value, then it will trigger. And for the high threshold, if it is above this value, it will trigger. So in this case, let's just say this is directly 2 degrees Celsius. So below 10 degrees Celsius, I want it to trigger, and above 20 20 degrees, I want it to trigger. But in between, I am fine to have it as is. Of course, I don't have to do both of these trigger sources. I could have just the low one or just the high one. In this case, I'm having a combined combination here. Okay. Now I go back. I make sure I have my trigger sources here. Trigger check period is how often it checks the value of the ADC to know whether to trigger or not. So default value is 1 second, which is in units of milliseconds, hence why is it 1000. So you can change this depending on your application. Now if I click reset on my board here in front of me, and I click run in RAM, now when that low threshold is violated or that high threshold is violated on my board, I will be able to detect this triggered BLE beacon advertising 6 times at a 1 second interval. Okay, so that is how you would set up a triggered advertising BLE beacon. Thank you for joining me.